You are connected to the correct event for Power BI with RE and FENXT. I'm your host today. Got a few folks still coming in, but we're a couple minutes in. We've got a lot of content to cover and only 45 minutes to do it. So let's go ahead and get started, shall we? Let me start by sharing my screen for all of you. And all right, here's what I want to show. So we are going to talk about analysis with RENXT and FENXT. I'm part of a group called npAutomate, a company I founded a number of years ago. And a great deal of the work that we do is directly related to analytics and reporting and producing Power BI reports for organizations. And what we found over the years is the hardest part of all this is the data and getting the data in a good, efficient, effective manner out of these NXT solutions. We have some organizations where once we get the data and make it a bit more intuitive for them, they're able to go and build a lot of their own reports. And sometimes we get them started by building a few, but it can really empower users to start building out a lot of the analytics once they figure out how to get to data. There's a few methods of doing that, and one that we're going to really spend some time in showing you some examples today. I always like to highlight, hopefully this little thing is out of the way up top, but I always like to highlight the idea of Power BI promoting digital transformation. People want information, and every organization looks at information differently. They track information differently. You track things within custom fields in a unique manner, and your Razor's Edge or Financial Edge aren't the only systems within the organization. You've got other systems in place too. So we want to ensure that you have good, ready access to the information, and that your stakeholders have good, ready access to the information they need at any given time without someone just having to go run a bunch of manual reports and send it to someone, which is the approach a lot of us have taken for many years. So some of the reasons we find organizations are embracing Power BI is just for better elements of reporting and more unique ways of combining and joining data together. We have a few organizations we work with that like to track revenue over expense for events, for example. So, that's encompassing a few different data sources, in some cases Razor's Edge and Financial Edge, on a common field to be able to join information together. Another good example with this 360-degree view example is organizations that do some element of program management or care management, if you're working with different types of individuals, where you're tracking a lot of other data that is a bit outside of just traditional fundraising information. So in doing that, there's some value in providing, this additional views of information and either displaying it within the system or within reports, wherever you may consume that information. I always think it's important to really consider other data sources that you may also want to include within reporting. We recognize that your organizations are probably using more than just Razor's Edge NXT or more than just Financial Edge NXT. So, one of the approaches we typically take and we recommend is using a data warehouse within Azure, and that can be utilized to join other data and other elements within that analytics. So certainly, think more broadly of would it be valuable to join data from other systems? And historically, people think of, just integrations. Let's take that data from another system and let's just push it in. Let's import it into Razor's Edge. There is value in some cases in instead of taking that step, just really pulling that data and joining that data within reporting. And that's what we'll talk about some today. Some of the ways that you can access Power BI reports, some of the ways that we've helped organizations do it is either through Blackbaud NXT, on a constituent record, on a project record, on the homepage, within a tile or within a pop-up, within Microsoft Teams, within a channel. Certainly websites, you've got Power BI apps or anything else that can really consume an iframe. These are all options of ways that people can consume this information once the information is put together. And we are heavy users of the Microsoft Power Platform. So we like this approach because it does give organizations the ability to start doing some of this on their own. We implement these solutions within your Microsoft 365 environment, whether it's apps or whether it's Power BI or whether it's automations. So that can be utilized, by the organization to create other examples of what they want. So, sometimes we might help an organization build a few reports, and then they find 3 other reports that they want to build, and they've already got the data they need, and they've got some examples to work off of. So, really straightforward to get these pieces if you're already on MS365, and certainly priced very well. I don't want to spend too much time here, but I always like to throw up this matrix just to give you a little better insight in terms of what options exist where. We're going to really focus in on this Razor's Edge NXT and Financial Edge NXT today, and we're going to focus on accessing the information with Sky API and Azure. And so I'm going to show you some examples of that. Certainly, you can actually do database access if you get a nightly backup. But then you've got to build reports off of that. I think that's only relevant if you already have those reports and you're only getting the data nightly. So it's not going to be updated throughout the day. You can always use queries and exports and dump to Excel or, use that as sources for your reporting if you want. We do no longer recommend the Power BI custom connectors that are currently on the website. They aren't really supported. They aren't updated. And once you utilize those, it's really hard to kind of get those to refresh in a recurring manner. So most of the effort is really focused on this idea of providing access using the Sky API, and those are the examples we'll work through today with you. And certainly those can be embedded within the Blackball solution. So a couple of quick examples before we jump into kind of a how-to. How do we produce some of this information that people want to report off of? And today the focus is really on getting the data out, but I think it's always good to show some examples. Here's an example of a full page add-in that is displaying unique Power BI reports on each page, and just some elements of the type of information you want to look at. I think some of you already have some of these things in mind, and you almost always want to start by thinking about what you want to see, what you want to report on for different people, whether it's you've got a capital campaign going on or something else that's really relevant. What's the information you need, and then we're going to figure out how to get that data as often as necessary. You'll see here in this case, the information is refreshed every 2 hours, and we went ahead and just added that message on the report page. In some cases, organizations may update this data hourly with the latest information. Some organizations are okay with just nightly updates, but always using the Sky API to get the data, so it's somewhat set it and forget it. Jump ahead to a few other views. I'm going to jump past these. Organizations may break out giving by different elements and just want to quickly see these components. Sometimes you can build these dashboards, within Razor's Edge using the analytics, but again, you have so much more flexibility with Power BI just to build exactly what your organization wants to see. It's not uncommon for organizations to really write this up or almost write it on a sheet of paper as a starting point of here's what we want, or it's even more common to get it in Excel with various graphs and pieces of saying, okay, we want to take this thing that takes a while to build in Excel and we have to, constantly pull data to update it and load it into a data sheet. And how can we automate this using BI? I like this example. This is, again, showing revenue and expenses, which is crossing systems. So we implemented this for an organization that was able to keep track of their events that they were tracking within Razor's Edge and compare that to the expense coding of the money that was being spent on those events, while also giving the organization the ability to drill into the event or the appeal. In this case, the appeal and the event is the same thing, but here's a nice example of being able to just put in a little hyperlink, right, that reads off of the event ID to be able to drill directly to a record in the system. So you log into Razor's Edge NXT, you're looking at a mission critical report, probably access from the home page, but then have the ability to open up a record. So you're not just looking at static data or static information. You can drill down to get more detail, or you can go directly to the record to see more information. And when you drill in, you may also want to show these Power BI reports within tiles, right? So you can develop custom tiles, as you're probably aware, to leverage things like Power Apps or Power BI, and we've used both pretty heavily. These are both examples of Power BI reports that are displaying information about that specific event. What was the revenue? What was the expense? How many registered to attend? How many attended? And here's a breakdown of every single payment that was made out of that event. We're in Razor's Edge, but we're looking at accounting data, in this case, that came from Financial Edge. Filters is typically a big component of what people want to see too. A lot of times you put filters across the top. Sometimes we'll set them up to pop out from the left. Again, just to give people the ability to quickly hone in on what they want to see within reporting. I think this screen shows another example, an organization that's tracking a lot of different chapters. And we talked to numerous organizations that want to keep better track of who are our new donors, who are our existing, who are our major donors, how many are we adding, what type of metrics or goals have we set in terms of what we're trying to get to, and how we can get to those. In some cases, people are using other data sources like Excel or like a Dataverse or something else to even put in some of these goals if there's not a good home within Razor's Edge to capture that. But that can all be joined together to break down the information. So hopefully some of these examples are just, helping to illustrate how flexible these reports can be. But the hardest part about getting reports out of the system is getting to the data and getting to the information you need. This last example I'm going to show you is an example of the Razor's Edge homepage. And we start showing some very specific program management, care management capabilities displayed within the screen. So in addition to tracking fundraising within the system, we work with a number of organizations that are tracking other programs or other initiatives that are taking place. And so they want to keep track of how many recipients they have or how many grants they've made or other things like that within, quick key metrics that are constantly being updated every time that database is being refreshed with more data throughout the day. So again, getting back to the hard part, what does it take to connect NXT to Azure via the Sky API? I mentioned earlier, we like to use the Microsoft Power Platform. Now, sometimes that's Power Automate, and sometimes that's Azure Logic apps based on what an organization prefers. You can really use either one to get data out of Blackbaud's, different API endpoints or Sky API endpoints and get them over to what we recommend, Azure SQL. Again, just like MS365, nonprofits can, set up a SQL database within Azure, within your own environment. It's very inexpensive. You really need kind of the lowest level of a database because typically you don't have millions and millions of transactions. So you're paying anywhere from $5 to $10 a month for a SQL database that's running in Azure. And that gives you the ability to connect the data into a source that you can constantly refresh when running reports in Power BI. And that's one of the keys. You want to get data in a nice, intuitive fashion and then be able to refresh over and over again. So you want to have, as part of this setup, the MS Power Platform in your marketplace. So if you go into Razor's Edge NXT or Financial Edge NXT and you choose Marketplace, you need to turn on that capability. You've probably already got it working. Some of you may not realize that also allows for access to things like Financial Edge NXT, even though they don't have built-in endpoints for Financial Edge NXT. Got a couple of examples of that, and we've also got a session on Thursday this week on how to access Financial Edge NXT data using this guy add-in, the HTTP add-in, but it all starts with having this marketplace piece turned on so you can get to the data. Then you need an Azure SQL database, and then you need some Power BI Pro licenses for users to be able to get to that data. This section here actually should have gone under here. So the Azure SQL database, we typically recommend DTU based, basic or standard, which is dramatically cheaper than some of the other components you may have to purchase through Azure SQL. So that's just getting the pieces in place for what you're going to do. Then it's all a matter of identifying the data. So you need to think of what data do we need from NXT and how we're going to get to that. So you're either going to have it existing, like an existing connection you can use within Razor's Edge that Blackbaud has published, or if there's other pieces within Razor's Edge or Financial Edge or any other Blackbaud component that has an API, I'm going to show you how to get to that information. One of the things I typically like to do, and I'll show you an example in a moment, is just pull some data and take a look at it within a JSON parser or within something that'll show you those fields. Now, Blackbaud has all this documented in a lot of cases on the developer site, but there's nothing like seeing your own data and getting a better sense of what you want to create within your data store, within your data warehouse as you're setting this up. So once you figure out what fields and what data you need, what elements you need, then it's just a matter of setting up these tables, then Azure SQL, and then grabbing the data. So grabbing the data that you've gathered from these different endpoints and pushing it into those tables. Now, some of you watching this, you may find this is a little bit advanced. That does involve some SQL query, experience. Although Google is quite helpful, and even things like ChatGPT can be very helpful with this too. But using SQL queries to insert data that you're pulling from Razor's Edge or Financial Edge into the system. And then if you've got more than 5,000 records you want to pull at a time, I'm going to show you how we typically loop through to get that data. So, some organizations might benefit from someone like us or another partner helping to get these building blocks in place for you. And that's certainly something we do for a lot of pieces. And then you're off to the races with reporting. But we are going to show you how we do this today. So let's take a closer look at that now, if I can. And I want to take a look over to, I know my Zoom meeting's trying to pop up. So I want to take a look over at stop sharing for a moment. Trying to figure out how to make that thing disappear from the top. I'm going to stop my video for a second, see if I can share again. I can't see exactly what I'm doing, but so like I mentioned earlier, we can use the Power Automate or Logic apps to start pulling some of this data that we want to grab. So one of the things that we'll want to start with is just gathering the data, just getting results out of the system to see what it is we need to create and build. And so I've got a very, very small record set here. And I'm just going to get to this section where we just get records out of the system. And I'm going to add a terminate here just so it stops, because I don't want to go any further than this one step. I think terminate's really useful within Power Automate, just as a tip, when you're trying to just check one part of it and see how it's working before you go further into other steps. Now, again, you're going to find typically Blackbaud's got so many different ways of getting data already defined. So, within the Razor's Edge, you've got the ability to get things like constituent information and event information. So you can use these, and we use these to grab lots and lots of data, in some cases millions of constituent records that people might need. Now, if you've got lots and lots of records, I'm going to talk to you in a moment about ways of doing updates as opposed to just having to rerun this every single time. But one thing we find is, we can get a constituent list using constituent search within this, and that's a good one just to pull, say, 5,000 records at a time and get what you need. But what you can't get to are things like constituent codes. List constituent codes. But when I click it, it wants a constituent ID. Well, that's no good. I want to get all of the constituent codes, or I want to get all of the custom fields. Historically, we had to build custom connectors for organizations to allow for that, right? But that's no longer required now that Blackbaud is enabled this HTTP add-in. So whether you're using one of these built-in connectors to get something like a gift list or a constituent list, or whether you're using the Blackbaud, you would search for Blackbaud, Sky add-ins, and then you choose send an HTTP request. This is going to give you access to everything else you're going to need to access, within these other pieces, like give me all constituent codes, because Blackbaud does have an endpoint for that, or give me all custom fields. So this can be very effectively used to get pieces like that. And it's really just a matter of going to the developer site and matching up with what you're trying to pull, for example. So in my case right now, I'm in this quick example, I'm trying to pull transactions from the GL system. So, there's that's going to be under Financial Edge. But if we were trying to get all constituent
custom fields out of the system, that's under constituent. But we don't want to just pull it for each constituent, because that would take forever, and I'd have to input every single constituent ID in the system. It's like I'd have to pull each constituent and loop through and figure out what goes with what. And that's going to take a considerable amount of time. So in this case, you'll see the ability to get constituent custom field, list all constituents. So that's what you want if you want to pull something like constituent custom fields or constituent codes or anything else. Relationships is another good example where you want to grab it for everyone. So there's good documentation around this Sky add-in, this HTTP add-in, but you just want to paste that into the request and then add any parameters that you may need. And that's specifically what I did here within this transaction pool, where I'm just pulling the transactions, and then I'm putting in the other parameters that you typically see within these asks of like, how many records? Do we need to use a date modified if we don't want to pull every transaction in the system? And all that is documented back on that specific endpoint that you may be looking at. So now we're going back to the transactions. We're going back to Financial Edge to find that specific endpoint. So I encourage you to take full advantage of this new HTTP Sky add-in, because the sky's the limits. It gives you access to all of the endpoints, not just Razor's Edge NXT and Financial Edge NXT. Any Sky API connection can be accessed from that connection. So let's run this just to get results. And again, I always recommend this even before you try creating a table with an Azure SQL or putting information into the table. It's a good idea just to start by seeing what you're working with and what your data looks like, how it's shaped. Those schema examples within the developer site isn't always sufficient. Sometimes it's not including all the fields you might need. And as you can imagine, this ran very, very quickly. This HTTP process runs very quickly, by the way. But what I want to do in this case is get my results. Now, I've only got 374 transactions. I've got a very small database. So it may just be like select all, control A. But if you have a lot of data, you'll have a little button you'll click and it'll pull up another page for you. I absolutely recommend using a parser, and the one I like to use is this online JSON viewer.
JSONviewer.stack.hu. It's highly recommended by a lot of developers, but there's other ones too. So I just always type parse JSON HU and search to find what I want. But it's just a matter of pasting your results into this text section and then going over to viewer so you can view your data. So it's got 374 results, just like we saw. And within each
result, I get the ability to see all the fields that
I can pull. So I got an ID, an amount, and a batch ID, transaction code values if I chose to use those. I didn't in this case. So it shows you the shape of everything that you want to work with. And I think that's going to be really helpful as you start trying to create some of these tables within SQL and then populating those tables. So that's the first element of really understanding the data you're going to be working with. And terminate. I'm going to pull this back down here. That's not fully required. And I'm going to move this out of the way because I already have the table within Azure SQL. And this is that table. Now, notice I'm not in Azure SQL right now. So we use SQL Server Management Studio, just a local copy, to access that Azure environment. And this is the table that we're looking at. So it's already been created. These are my different fields that we've added to that. But typically what we do is create the table through Power Automate. We have a component that just runs the first time to build the table. And my computer's locking up, which will create the fields that we need. And again, that's part of understanding what fields you need and the types of fields that you need to set up. And then we just add that first section as a primary key. You could have just as easily gone into SQL and just created this particular table. But that's the very first step of this process is you need to create the table. I'm going to push this down here out of the way with a terminate because I just want to keep it as part of our discussion if there's questions about it. But that's the first step is you need to have that table. Now you have a scenario where every time you run this process, what we like to do is truncate that table, get the records, and then insert those values. So again, these are using SQL queries within Power Automate. So if you type SQL Server or just SQL by itself, so wait for this to populate. You'll choose SQL Server, and the connection we like to use is execute a SQL query v2. It's nice because you can embed the results into that. So that's what these all are, is execute a SQL query v2, where you connect to your database, you authenticate to it. You only have to do that once. In some cases, we use MFA authentication or Active Directory, so it can work and just be username and password to the server. I saw a session earlier where Alex was sitting in and he recommended using this OpenJSON. And we partnered with Alex's team to kind of come up with this initially. And that's the approach we like to use. Now, if I can help anyone kind of get their arms around this, please email me. I'll make sure you have my email at the end of this meeting, and I'm happy to help you get your arms around this. But it's really just a matter of inserting into that table you just created these values. And if you Google OpenJSON, insert or SQL Server, insert OpenJSON, you're going to find all this documentation about how to basically pull the data from this source, which is that get record source we just grabbed in the value, and put that parameter into our SQL statement. And then this will put in, say, 5,000 records at a time and works very, very quickly to load the data. Even with 1 million records, it's only going to take, say, 15, 20 minutes to get everything in there. So not a bad process. But again, it's a matter of mapping the value that's coming from NXT telling it the type of value it is that aligns with the table you created, and then telling it the value within the database. Actually, I'm backwards. Here's the value within the database, and here's the value within NXT. So again, I'm happy to give you some tips if you'll send me an email and show you how to do this if you want to try it on your own. If this is more than you want to get into and you don't really want to get into the creation of the SQL, our organization can always help you get all this in place, make sure it's updating hourly or every couple of hours, set up some nice intuitive views within SQL, and then you're off to the races with reporting and with the data. Now, what we typically have to do, I only had like 400 records here, but in a lot of cases, there's 1 million records. And so we typically pull a count to help determine how many records we're working with. We increment an offset value, and then we start going through a loop. So we start looping through, okay, if the offset is less than, that overall count that we're looking for, let's just do this again. Let's pull the next 5,000 records and let's insert those values. So it's really the same thing. We just keep incrementing up and up and up. So, whether it's 5,000 records or whether it's 2 million records, this solution can be used to populate that information. Now, with that said, if you have 1 million records, maybe this isn't the ideal way to do it. Running this every night might be okay, but you might just prefer to pull the iterative or the updates, which we can show you in just a moment. A lot of these record sets may be small and it's going to be based on each organization, but that's really all it takes to run through this on a nightly basis, let's say, and empty that table, reload the table, and then get to the results of what we're looking for. And that's where you end up with all of these different components or tables that are in place. So we've got a few here for general ledger within our little test environment. We've got some for accounts payable, vendors, and invoices. Got a lot for constituents and Razor's Edge information. The codes are all in one table. The custom fields are in a table. The constituents are in a table. So these can all be accessed from Power BI. Now, there are situations where we'll create views, which you can also access from Power BI if organizations don't want to be dealing with too many joins. So, as you know, when you get data and you connect to data sources, these are all tables you can connect to and you can join them together, within your structure of Power BI. But sometimes organizations like, just to have one view that's already combining a lot of this data, where the gift table, for example, includes the constituent name and includes pertinent information about the constituent, as opposed to just the constituent ID or the lookup ID for the constituent. So it's really just whatever you prefer in terms of if you want to join the information here or if you want to do it over in Excel. So again, I encourage you on this part, feel free to send me an email and we'll give you a little more insight in terms of how we approach this and how we help empower organizations to, connect NXT to Azure SQL through this element or through these automations. But the end result is having it here. The data is being refreshed constantly, and that's the hardest part of Power BI reporting is getting to that data within the system. So let me jump back real quick. So just to summarize what we talked about, that initial setup, identifying the data, just run a process, just ask for data, look at those results in a parser or in some type of online view to get a better sense of what fields you need, create that table within SQL, and then use your insert to get the data in there. And then if it is greater than 5,000, run a loop. Just do a condition to see if it's more than 5,000 records, and then a do until to keep looping until your count is greater than or equal to however many records you have. So the next step is getting that data into Power BI. So you want to use Power BI Desktop. We haven't really had a lot of success trying to build reports on Power BI online yet. So you want to get started with the Power BI Desktop, and then you want to publish the report. So that's just a matter of once you've got that report in place, you click on the Publish button once you're logged into the right environment. and that'll push that information up to your BI service for you. I had it all up and I can't get behind this screen and Zoom. This thing across the top. Now we do recommend, and I mentioned it on this slide, we recommend a shared workspace. Share it to a shared workspace because that's going to allow you to share it to other users. So in our test environment, we've got a workspace called Intelligence. And why it's important to put it there and not your own workspace within the online Power BI is that you can manage access and invite other people to it. That will determine if they can see that report, whether they're viewing it within Blackbaud or whether they're viewing it in Teams or anywhere else. So you determine who can see that report, even if they get to a constituent record that has a Power BI report within a tile. Unless it's shared to them, they won't be able to see that report. So that report that we uploaded is now here, and it's just a matter of saving the URL, and then you can paste that right into a Blackbaud screen like the home page. Blackbaud has great documentation on how to do that and affect the sizing and everything else of what you want to do there. So the last piece we want to think about is the refresh. Within that web view, you have the ability to define how often that report is going to be refreshed. And this is the real value of essentially using this as opposed to getting a nightly backup from Blackbaud, because we can schedule that refresh to happen hourly, if you like, right? Just by going to settings and scheduling a refresh to run every hour. Now, that assumes that we're actually updating the data in the database every single hour. So typically we'll take an approach where the automations in Power Automate will run at the top of the hour or at the bottom of the hour, and the report refreshes will run at the top of the hour, if it's something you want on an hourly basis. But think about how often you need something in terms of what you're configuring. But it's just a matter of going over here to the refresh section and defining how often you want that report to update by adding times, and then going back to these processes that are configured and changing your manually trigger a flow to a schedule and tell that to run on an hourly basis or every 2 hours. So in that way, you're updating the data on a constant basis, and then you're pushing that data up to Power BI on a constant basis. The last thing I'll highlight, and don't have a ton of time to cover it, but I'm going to show you a little bit about how to do it, is if you do have large data sets, you want to be able to use iterative updates. And so again, just pulling the latest things that have changed. And we use staging databases for that. So like transactions or constituents or gifts, those are all elements that will be pulled into a staging table of the last ones that have changed within the last day or the last few hours. And then those are inserted into the transaction table or the constituent table or the gift table, either updating existing records or inserting new records. And so in order to take advantage of that, I've got an example here where we do iterative updates to transactions. And so instead of pulling all the transactions out of the system, say every hour, what we're doing on an hourly basis is pulling based on date modified. So every endpoint has date modified, whether it's constituents, gifts, anything else. So now what we're doing is we're starting by composing a date and then going backwards. I broke this into two pieces just to make it a little simpler to understand, but we're basically just going back a day and then pulling everything that is updated. At that point, we're pulling records, but we're using that date modified to only pull things that have changed. And then we're inserting the values into a staging table as opposed to the main table, a table that is a complete carbon copy of the main table. The last step of this is to merge that information. And again, you can find this information on the internet through Google searches. But what you'll notice here is that what we're doing is we're taking that data from staging, we're putting it in the other table. And if it does match, we're going to just update an existing record. Maybe if it was posted or someone updated an address in Razor's Edge. If it's not, if it's a new item, it's being inserted. So that date modified picks up new items and picks up changed items. So that can be really valuable. So please email me if you'd like more assistance in kind of getting some of these examples set up. We do something a bit more nuanced for gifts because we also need to pull gift splits and we need to pull gift soft credits. So for gift management, the way
Pardon
we
me,
typically approach
Barton, just a
that-
quick note. We have
Yeah.
about 3 minutes until the end of the session.
Okay, great. Thank you for the update. So last thing I want to show you is that for something like gifts, we're filling in a few tables or grabbing the gifts and the soft credits and the splits and, you know, populating 3 tables, even though it's all coming from a list gifts ask. So we're asking for a list of gifts or asking for the most modified gifts, but now we're putting it into 3 places, in a gift table and a split table and a soft credit table. So, you know, I encourage you to, if you haven't seen this type of approach before, give it a shot. Feel free to email me if we can provide any assistance, or if you prefer for someone like us to get the building blocks in place for you and you can use it on your own, we can certainly help you there too. So feel free to email me at barton.dyson@npAutomate.com. And thank you all for your time today.